You don't get to touch that.
That's my daughter's face, Douglas. Give it back.
It's marked $2. You want it, you buy it like everybody else standing in this yard.
Where is my mother? Somebody tell me where my mother is.
She's dead, Porter. 9 weeks dead and buried, and not one person from her side of the family bothered to show up. Because as far as anybody could tell, she didn't have family left who cared enough to ask. You didn't call me. You had my number for 6 years. You used it every Christmas. I called who needed calling. Funny how a son who couldn't find 10 minutes to visit his dying mother suddenly wants to make a scene about being left out. I called this house 11 times last spring. 11 times, Douglas. I don't recall a single one.
Daddy, why is he yelling?
Get in the truck for me, Ivy. Everything in this house is being cleared for closing Friday. You're welcome to keep shopping. Or you can leave the way you left everything else around here. Your choice.
You're selling her house. You're selling my kid's picture off her own mantle in front of strangers, and you didn't call me when she died. I called who I thought needed calling. Douglas's voice dropped back down, level now, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than the shouting had been. Vivian and I had a very quiet last few years, Porter. She didn't talk about you much toward the end. I assumed you'd finally made your peace with staying gone. Porter reached past him, picked the photograph back up off the table himself, and did not put it down again. And for one long second, neither man moved. The whole yard gone silent around them, waiting to see which one of them would be the one to back down first. I'm not leaving, Porter said. Not until somebody tells me what happened to my mother. He stood there in the yard of the house he'd grown up in, holding a $2 photograph of his own daughter, surrounded by strangers pricing his mother's life at a folding table, and understood, before he had words for it, that the silence between him and Vivian had never been as mutual as he'd let himself believe. Porter Ashford was 41 years old, and 4 years earlier he had run a small residential remodeling company with his name on the truck doors and 11 employees who trusted him with their mortgages. Then his wife Noelle got sick, the kind of sick that ate 2 years and every ounce of attention he had left over, and the business went first, quietly, the way things go when a man stops answering his phone. Noelle died 2 years ago. Porter now worked the overnight stocking shift at a home improvement warehouse, and if anyone from his old life saw him there in the fluorescent aisles at 2 in the morning, he let them assume whatever story was easiest for them to believe. His daughter Ivy was 10. Careful and watchful in the particular way of children who've already learned that adults don't always tell you the whole truth up front, and she kept a small keepsake box under her bed where she put anything she decided mattered. She had never really known her grandmother, not the way Porter remembered knowing his own, because somewhere in the wreckage of those 2 years, the calls between Porter and Vivian had thinned out, and pride, on both sides as far as he knew, had let the silence keep going longer than either of them meant it to. Before all of it, before Noelle's illness and the business and the long silence, Porter remembered his mother mostly through small, specific things. The way she'd stood in his driveway the day he closed on his first company truck, laughing at how proud he looked leaning against the door. The smell of her kitchen on Sunday mornings when Ivy was still an infant, and Vivian would drive out just to hold her while Porter slept an extra hour. That version of his mother had never once made him feel like a disappointment. He was the one who'd let the distance grow, first out of exhaustion, then out of a shame he never quite found the words to explain to her. And by the time he'd had the strength to try, Douglas had already made himself the only door left standing between them. He had written her 3 letters over the last 2 years, careful ones, apologizing for the distance, asking to visit. He had never once gotten a reply. He would spend the next several weeks learning that his mother had never gotten them either. He drove straight from the estate sale to the county courthouse, Ivy quiet in the back seat clutching the $2 photograph like it might be taken from her too. The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and old paper, fluorescent lights humming overhead, Ivy's shoes squeaking softly on the tile as she followed him to the records window. A clerk in probate records pulled the file without much interest, sliding it across the counter the way she'd slid 100 files that week. Estate of Vivian Kane, she read off the cover. Closed 3 weeks ago, uncontested. I'm her son. I never contested anything because nobody told me there was anything to contest. The clerk's expression shifted, not unkind, just tired in the way of someone who'd seen this particular confusion before. According to the file, all known heirs were accounted for. There's a waiver on record. She turned the folder around so he could see it. Waiver and disclaimer of interest in estate. Signed by a Porter Ashford, notarized 7 weeks ago. Porter looked down at his own name in a stranger's handwriting, close enough to his signature that a person who didn't know him well might not question it, and felt the floor of the last 3 weeks drop out from under him a second time. I didn't sign this. I've never seen this document in my life. I can't make a legal determination, sir. I can only tell you what's on file. The clerk's voice softened half a degree, the kind of small, unofficial gentleness that wasn't in her job description. If you believe this is fraudulent, you'd want to talk to an attorney about reopening the estate. That's not something we handle at this counter. He sat in his truck in the courthouse parking lot for a long time afterward. Ivy in the back seat asking if they could go somewhere for lunch, patient in the way she'd learned to be patient with him since her mother died, and Porter understood that his daughter had already spent 2 years watching her father get quietly dismantled by things he couldn't control, and he was not going to let her watch it happen a second time without a fight. That night, after Ivy had gone quiet over her plate at dinner, pushing food around instead of eating it, Porter sat down across from her instead of letting the silence stretch the way silences in his family had a habit of doing. "You can be sad about this," he told her. "You didn't get to know her very well, and now you never will, and that's allowed to hurt even though you barely met her." "Is it my fault?" Ivy asked so quietly he almost missed it. "Did she not want to see me because of something I did?" "No." He said it fast, firm, before the question could take root anywhere in her. "None of this had anything to do with you. It didn't even have as much to do with me as I thought it did this morning. Something got in the way between your grandmother and me, and I let it sit there too long instead of pushing through it. That part's on me. None of it is on you." Ivy studied him the way she studied everything, carefully, checking his answer against what she already believed. "Then we're going to find out what really happened, right?" "We are," Porter said. "Every bit of it." He found Bridget Colfax through a probate litigation listing he found searching half-blind at a library computer that night, a small practice 2 towns over that specialized in exactly this kind of mess. She read the waiver twice before she said anything, holding it at an angle to the window light like she was checking for a watermark. Her office was small, 2 rooms above a dry cleaner, stacks of files organized in a system only she seemed to fully understand, and she listened to Porter's whole story without once interrupting before she finally spoke. "This notarization is the whole ballgame," she told him. "Every state has different rules, but broadly, a disclaimer like this only works if it was actually executed the way it claims, signed in front of a notary who verified your identity. If you can prove you never sat across from this notary, the disclaimer falls apart. And once it falls apart, the entire probate order built on top of it falls apart with it. So we just tell the court I never signed it." "What? We tell the court? And then we prove it 6 different ways because your stepfather's attorney is going to argue you're a disgruntled son inventing a story to get money you gave up voluntarily. Judges have heard that excuse from people who actually did sign things and regretted it. We need more than your word." She tapped the notary's stamp at the bottom of the page, starting with him. The notary's name was Gary Holt, and a quick search told Bridget everything she needed to place him. A longtime friend of Douglas's from a golf league that met every Saturday at the same public course for over a decade. Notaries were required by law to keep a journal of every document they witnessed, a signature and a thumbprint for each transaction. If Gary Holt's journal had no matching entry, or an entry that didn't match Porter's actual whereabouts that day, the fraud would be sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally ask to see it. "We'll subpoena the journal," Bridget said. "In the meantime, don't contact Douglas directly if you can avoid it. Let him think you're grieving and confused and slow to act. The moment he thinks you're building a real case, he stops being careless." She walked him to the door, one hand briefly on his shoulder in a way that felt more like reassurance than professional habit. "I know this feels like it's moving too slowly to matter. It isn't. Careful is what wins these." Porter took that advice more literally than he expected to have to. 2 days later, Douglas called him himself. Voice warm, in a way it had never once been warm in the 12 years he'd known the man, asking whether Porter wanted to come by and take a few more of Vivian's things before the closing, for Ivy's sake. Porter stood in his kitchen, gripping the phone hard enough to hurt his own hand, and made himself sound grateful. "That would mean a lot, Douglas. Thank you for thinking of us." He pressed the phone against his ear a little harder, forcing the anger in his chest down into something that wouldn't carry in his voice. "Of course. Family's family." A pause, just long enough to notice. "I know this has all been a shock. I hope you don't think I did anything wrong here." "I don't know what to think yet," Porter said, which was, of everything he said in that call, the only completely true sentence. Ivy asked him that night, unprompted, whether it was okay to still hope Douglas might have a good explanation for all of it, and Porter told her that hoping for the best in people wasn't a weakness, only something you had to hold loosely enough to let go of the moment the evidence told you otherwise. Bridget's subpoena for Gary Holt's notary journal took 2 weeks to produce anything, and in the meantime, she kept digging in directions Porter hadn't thought to look. What she found widened the whole shape of what Douglas had done far past a single forged signature. "Your mother had a standing lunch with 2 friends from her church for over 20 years, Bridget told him, laying out a set of interview notes she'd taken herself. "Both of them told me the lunches stopped almost entirely the last 3 years of her life. One of them said Douglas started answering Vivian's phone for her, saying she wasn't feeling well, often enough that eventually people stopped calling at all." She looked up at him. "This isn't just about you, Porter." He was narrowing the whole circle of people who might have noticed something was wrong. Why? What was he protecting himself from a widow's church friends for? Money, most likely, and I mean that in the most literal sense. I pulled some public records on him. He had a cardiac surgery 4 years ago that his insurance only partially covered, and a home equity loan taken out against a property he no longer owns, which tells me he was already underwater before your mother's estate ever became relevant. A man that far in debt, watching a will that splits everything in half, starts looking for a way to make the other half disappear. She closed the folder. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because juries and judges respond better to a real motive than to a cartoon villain, and this one's real enough. What Bridget's records couldn't show, and what Porter would only piece together much later, was the particular shape of Douglas's resentment, built slowly over a decade of feeling like a placeholder in his own marriage. He had married Vivian 8 years after his first wife left him, grateful and a little desperate for a second chance at being someone's whole world. And he had never quite managed to stop measuring himself against a first husband he'd never met and a son he'd decided, without much evidence, must have been the favorite all along. The surgery and the debt had simply given his resentment a number to attach itself to, a concrete sum that made an old, vague grievance feel, for the first time, like something he could actually solve. Porter thought of Douglas's warm voice on the phone. Family's family, and felt something harden in his chest that hadn't been there before. A kind of clarity replacing the grief that had been doing most of the work until then. He met one of the church friends himself, a soft-spoken woman named Cora Lee who had known Vivian since before Porter was born, at a diner Bridget suggested for its quiet corner booths. Cora Lee stirred her coffee for a long moment before she spoke, gray-haired and steady-eyed, like she'd been waiting years for someone to finally ask. "Soko, your mother used to talk about you every single lunch," Cora Lee said. "Then, about 3 years back, she stopped bringing you up at all. I assumed something had happened between you two, something private, and I didn't want to pry. Looking back, I think I mistook a woman being cut off for a woman who'd simply moved on." She reached across the table and pressed Porter's hand briefly. "I'm sorry I didn't ask harder. I keep thinking about all the lunches after that, how quiet she got, and how I told myself it was just her age." "You couldn't have known," Porter said, though the words cost him something to say out loud because he was still working out how much of the same forgiveness he owed himself. "Maybe not, but I'll testify to every lunch I remember, if it helps you get back what's yours." Corley's voice hardened in a way that surprised him, coming from a woman who'd spent the whole conversation so gentle. "I've known Douglas Kane 12 years. I always thought there was something a little too careful about him. Now I understand what I was noticing." The supervised visit to collect more of Vivian's belongings happened that Saturday, arranged through Bridget so there'd be a witness present, a paralegal from her office standing quietly in the doorway while Porter and Ivy moved through rooms that still smelled faintly like his mother's hand cream. Douglas hovered nearby at first, offering to help, growing quieter as Porter methodically opened drawers he clearly hadn't gotten around to clearing yet. It was Ivy who found it, in the back of a hallway closet, a cedar box with a small brass latch that she recognized without being told, as exactly the kind of box she kept under her own bed for things that mattered. "Dad!" Her voice had a strange, careful pitch to it. "There's a lot of stuff in here with my name on it." Porter crossed the room and knelt beside her as she lifted the lid. Inside, in neat, rubber-banded stacks organized by year, were birthday cards. Dozens of them, each one addressed in his mother's careful handwriting to Ivy Ashford. None of them stamped, none of them ever mailed. Underneath the cards sat a cloth-bound journal, its spine cracked from use. Porter opened it to a page near the middle, a date from 4 years back, and read his mother's handwriting in a room gone completely silent around him. "I mailed another card to Ivy today. Douglas says he'll take it to the post office with his own errands since my hip's been bad. I hope this one finally gets an answer. I don't understand why she never writes back. Maybe I did something to Porter I still don't understand, and this is what it costs." His hands were shaking by the third entry. Vivian had written Porter's current address correctly twice in different years, information she could only have had if she'd asked someone for it, or if Douglas had given it to her and then simply never mailed what she wrote. She had not stopped reaching for them. Someone had stood in the doorway of that reaching for years and made sure it never crossed the threshold. She never sent them, Ivy said very quietly, holding one card unopened in both hands, her own name and her grandmother's handwriting on the front. She wrote them every single year, and she never even got to send them. Porter put his arm around his daughter and did not trust himself to speak for a long moment. When he finally did, it was to Bridget's paralegal, standing very still by the door with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what she was witnessing. "Photograph everything," Porter said. "Every card, every page of that journal, before we leave this room." Bridget, when she reviewed the photographs that evening, was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "This is the strongest piece of evidence I've seen in a case like this in years," she told him. "Not just legally, though it's devastating legally. It directly contradicts the sworn representation Douglas made to the probate court, that your whereabouts were unknown and no known heirs had been overlooked. Your mother knew exactly where you were. She proved it in her own handwriting, dated and specific, for 4 straight years." She paused. "If someone in your family ever becomes the only person your parent talks to, the only one answering the phone and handling the mail, that isn't closeness, Porter. That's a gate. You have to ask who's standing at it and why they're the only one still allowed through." The last piece came from a man Douglas had never once considered a threat. Earl Tanner had walked the same mail route for 22 years, long enough to know which houses got Christmas cards and which got none, long enough to recognize Vivian Kane's handwriting on an envelope before he'd even flipped it over to read the address. When Bridget's investigator tracked him down, retired now, gardening in his own front yard 2 streets over, he didn't hesitate, and he asked to meet Porter in person rather than just sign a statement. They sat on Earl's porch steps that Saturday. Ivy perched beside her father, working her way through a glass of lemonade Earl's wife had brought out without being asked, and Earl talked slowly, the way a man talks when he's been turning something over in his mind for longer than anyone realized. "She mailed cards regular, every year around the same week," Earl said. "Always stopped me at the box herself if she could, said she liked handing them over instead of just dropping them in. Liked seeing the stamp go on its way with her own hands. Then a few years back, her husband started intercepting me at the curb instead, telling me he'd take her outgoing mail in along with his own errands. Struck me as odd at the time. Wasn't my business to say so, not with the way people are these days about a mailman asking questions." "Do you remember the last time you saw her hand you something herself?" Porter asked. Earl thought about it, squinting toward the street like the answer might be parked there. "Maybe 3 years back. After that, it was always him at the box, rain or shine, real particular about it. I noticed because most folks don't care that much about their own mail." He looked at Porter for a long moment, then at Ivy, who was listening with the same careful attention she gave everything. "You're her son. She talked about you and your daughter more than you'd think, sir, for a woman whose husband kept telling folks she didn't. I'm glad to finally put a face to the name she was so proud of." Bridget filed an emergency motion to stay the property closing the following morning, the strongest tool she had against a calendar that didn't care about anyone's grief. The closing was set for the following Friday, 6 days out, and once a genuine buyer took possession, unwinding the sale would become exponentially harder no matter how clean the fraud evidence turned out to be. "Judges don't love stopping a closing at the last minute," Bridget warned him, "but a forged notarization tends to get their attention fast. I've attached the journal photographs and Earl Tanner's statement. That should be enough to get us a hearing before Friday." The notary journal itself arrived from Gary Holt's office 2 days later, produced under subpoena with visible reluctance, and Bridget found what she'd expected to find and still felt the weight of when she saw it in black and white. The page for the date the disclaimer claimed to be notarized showed no entry for Porter Ashford at all. It showed instead a residential lease renewal for a different client entirely, notarized 90 minutes before the disclaimer's stated signing time, in the very next entry after it was logged the following morning. "There's no gap in his schedule," Bridget told Porter. "There's no missing page, no torn-out entry. There's simply no record that you were ever in that office. In this state, that's not a technicality. That's the notarial equivalent of a confession." Douglas felt the walls of his own careful story closing in before he fully understood exactly how fast they were closing. The way people often do when a slow private crime finally starts becoming other people's problem too. Vivian's church friends had begun calling Porter directly once word worked its way back through the congregation that something was wrong, offering, without being asked, to say under oath how thin the visits had grown in those final years. Gary Holt stopped answering Douglas's calls the same week the subpoena landed at his office. A small betrayal Douglas would later admit, once cornered, that he'd taken harder than almost anything else in the whole ordeal. He tried Porter one more time, a Tuesday evening call that started warm and curdled fast once Porter didn't play along the way he had the first time. "I heard you've got a lawyer digging through my finances now," Douglas said. "That feels like a strange way to honor your mother's memory." "I think forging her son's signature was a strange way to honor her memory, Douglas. I'm just catching up. You don't know what those last years were like for me, taking care of a sick woman while her own son couldn't be bothered to visit. I wrote her 3 letters. She never got one of them. I know that now because she wrote it down herself, in her own handwriting, wondering why I never wrote back." Porter kept his voice level, the same steadiness he'd learned running a crew of 11 men who needed him calm on bad job sites. "You read those cards for years before you decided to keep them instead of mailing them. I don't know what story you've been telling yourself about that, but it isn't the one where you were protecting her." The line went quiet long enough that Porter almost thought Douglas had hung up. "The closing's Friday," Douglas finally said, flat now, all the warmth gone out of it. "Whatever you and your lawyer are planning, I hope it's fast." He hung up before Porter could answer, but he showed up in person 2 days later anyway, waiting by Porter's truck in the warehouse parking lot at the end of his shift, looking older than Porter remembered him looking even at the estate sale. "I came to ask you to drop it," Douglas said, no preamble. "Whatever this costs me legally, I can survive. What I can't survive is everyone in that church, everyone who ever respected me, finding out the details in a courtroom instead of hearing it from me first. Shoot. You should have thought about that before you forged my name and burned my mother's mail for 4 years. I never burned anything, not until—" Douglas stopped himself, and Porter watched him realize, a half-second too late, exactly what he'd just confirmed out loud. "Not until what, Douglas?" Douglas didn't answer. His face had gone a shade paler under the parking lot lights, and he got back in his car instead, hands visibly unsteady on the wheel. And Porter stood alone in the parking lot a long time afterward, turning that half-sentence over and over, understanding for the first time that whatever Douglas still had left to hide, he was already close enough to it that fear alone had started making his mouth run well ahead of his judgment. Bridget, hearing about the encounter the next morning, told Porter plainly that a man who slips like that in a parking lot isn't thinking about lawyers anymore. He's thinking about what's still sitting in his house that a court order hasn't reached yet. Porter thought about the cedar box, still sitting in that hallway closet because the supervised visit rules hadn't allowed them to remove anything before the estate dispute was resolved, only to photograph it, and felt a cold, specific fear settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with money at all. "He still has the originals," Porter said. "The cards, the journal. We only have photographs." "Photographs hold up in court," Bridget said. "But I understand why that isn't the same as having your mother's actual handwriting in your daughter's hands." She was quiet a moment. "I've asked the court to include an evidence preservation order alongside the stay motion. If it's granted before Friday, destroying anything in that house becomes its own separate crime, on top of everything else." The hearing on the stay motion was set for Friday morning, the same day as the closing, 4 hours apart. A coincidence of court scheduling that left almost no margin at all. Porter spent the Thursday night before it wide awake on his couch, Ivy long asleep down the hall with the $2 photograph propped on her nightstand where she'd put it the day they brought it home, and thought about his mother writing the same address correctly year after year into a book no one but her had ever meant to read. The judge signed the evidence preservation order at 9 that Thursday night, and Bridget texted Porter the confirmation just after 10, along with the name of the process server who'd serve it on Douglas first thing Friday morning, hours ahead of the stay motion hearing. It should have been enough time. Douglas had other plans for the hours in between. Earl Tanner still walked the old route most mornings out of habit. Retired 8 months, but unable to break 22 years of waking before dawn, and it was Earl who smelled the smoke first, a little after 6, thick and wrong for the season, drifting from the direction of Vivian's backyard. He knew that yard well enough to know nobody burned leaves there in the spring. He called Porter before he called anything else, his voice tight in a way Porter had never heard from the steady old man. "Porter, there's smoke coming off your mother's property, and I've got a bad feeling about it. You need to get over here." Porter left Ivy with the neighbor 2 doors down, already dressed for school, and broke every speed limit between his apartment and his mother's street, arriving to find Douglas crouched over a rusted burn barrel in the backyard, a box half fed into the flames, cedar corners already blackening at the edges. "Douglas, stop!" Porter came through the side gate at a dead run and grabbed the box before Douglas could push it fully in, wrenching it back hard enough that they both stumbled, papers scattering across the wet grass, some already curled black and unreadable, others still whole. "Get off my property." Douglas's voice had lost every trace of the warmth from the phone call, gone thin and cornered instead. He grabbed for the box again, and the two men went down together against the side of the barrel, Porter taking the worst of the heat radiating off the metal, refusing to let go. "This isn't your property anymore, and you know it." Porter got a knee against Douglas's chest and held him there, not gently. Both of them scraped and furious in the wet grass. "You forged my signature. You burned my mother's letters. You are done deciding what I do and don't get to know about my own family." Douglas twisted hard underneath him, one elbow catching Porter across the jaw before Porter got his weight fully settled, and for a moment the two of them strained against each other in silence, the barrel's heat radiating against Porter's forearm where he'd braced it too close, the smell of scorched cardboard and lighter fluid thick enough to catch in the back of his throat. Somewhere behind him, a scrap of paper caught by the wind lifted off the pile and drifted, still smoldering at one edge, into the wet grass, and Porter thought, with a strange, distant clarity, that this was the closest he'd ever come to losing something of his mother's a second time in the same year. Earl arrived on foot 2 minutes later, having called 911 the moment he hung up with Porter, and stood at the gate directing the responding officers straight to the backyard, where they found Douglas Kane pinned under a man half his age beside a smoking burn barrel and a scorched cardboard box, its scattered contents still bearing, in places the fire hadn't reached, Vivian Kane's unmistakable handwriting. The stay motion hearing that morning took on a different shape entirely once the arrest report reached Bridget's inbox an hour before the judge took the bench. She didn't need to argue hard. She laid out the notary journal's missing entry, Earl Tanner's sworn statement, the photographs of the cedar box, and finally the morning's police report, describing Douglas Kane found actively destroying estate evidence hours after being served notice of a preservation order he hadn't yet technically received but plainly already knew was coming. Gary Holt, questioned separately by a detective that same afternoon and shown the journal discrepancy laid out in black and white, lasted less than 20 minutes before he admitted the truth. He had never met Porter Ashford. Douglas had brought him the disclaimer already printed, asked him as a friend to stamp and notarize it without the formality of actually calling Porter in, and Gary, 30 years into a stagnant golf friendship and never once thinking it would matter this much, had signed it without a second thought. "He's the reason I made partner at the club, practically," Gary told the detective, sounding smaller with every sentence. "I didn't think one signature would hurt anybody." He signed his own statement without asking for a lawyer present, a decision his eventual attorney would later call reckless and Bridget would privately call the smartest thing he did in the entire affair. The hearing itself, when it convened that afternoon, was shorter than Porter had braced for. He sat beside Bridget at the petitioner's table, a bandage taped over a scrape on his forearm from the burn barrel, while Douglas's attorney tried, without much conviction, to argue that the morning's incident was unrelated to the merits of the underlying probate dispute. "Your Honor, a heated family disagreement doesn't retroactively prove fraud," the attorney said. "It does when the family disagreement in question involves the respondent actively burning the very documents this court ordered preserved less than 12 hours after that order was signed," the judge said without looking up from the file. "I've read the notary journal discrepancy, Ms. Colfax's exhibits, and this morning's police report. I don't need Mr. Kane's attorney to characterize any of it for me." She looked over her glasses at Douglas, who sat very still beside his lawyer, the fight already gone out of him. "The waiver is void as a product of fraud on this court. The estate closing is vacated. I'm ordering the probate matter reopened in full, and I'm referring the notarization itself for separate criminal review." Douglas didn't look at Porter on his way out of the courtroom. Porter found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't need him to. Porter stood outside the courthouse afterward with what remained of the cedar box in a paper evidence bag Bridget had let him keep a copy of, ash still on his sleeve, and felt, for the first time in 9 weeks, something other than grief sitting where the shock had been. Douglas was charged within days with probate fraud, forgery, and evidence tampering, the assault charge from the backyard added on once the responding officer's report made clear, from witness accounts and the scrapes on both men, who had actually thrown the first grab. Gary Holt surrendered his notary commission voluntarily before the state board could revoke it outright, cooperating fully once he finally understood how little of his old friendship was actually left worth protecting. The reopened estate proceeding, once finally underway, moved faster than Bridget had predicted. The forged waiver voided as a matter of law once the notary himself confirmed under oath it had never been properly executed. and the original 50-50 division of Vivian's estate was restored, this time with Porter's actual signature on every page that required it. Douglas, facing both the criminal charges and a mounting legal bill of his own, eventually agreed to a settlement rather than drag the estate through a full civil trial on top of it, a decision Bridget suspected had more to do with his attorney's advice than any late change of heart. He kept a modest portion carved out for his own remaining debts, a fraction of what he'd tried to take outright, and the rest came to Porter clean, along with a formal court finding that named the fraud for exactly what it was. Bridget called it, without much drama, the best outcome available once you accounted for how slowly the criminal side of these cases tended to move. Porter found he didn't need drama. He needed the finding, in writing, and he got it. Porter took Ivy to the cemetery for the first time 2 weeks after the hearing, on a mild, overcast Saturday morning, a visit he'd put off not out of avoidance but because he'd wanted to have something worth saying before he stood there. He'd missed the funeral entirely, learning about it only after the fact from a neighbor who assumed he already knew, and the guilt of that absence had sat in him heavier than almost anything else Douglas had taken from him. Coralie and 2 other women from the church met them there, having offered without being asked once word got around that Porter had missed the funeral entirely, and the small group stood together on the grass for 20 quiet minutes doing the thing Porter had never gotten the chance to do the first time, saying goodbye properly, out loud, with people who had actually known her. Vivian's headstone was simple. Granite, her name and dates, and a single line Douglas had chosen without consulting anyone. Beloved wife. Porter stood in front of it for a long moment with Ivy's hand in his, reading those 2 words and feeling the absence of everything they'd left out. The $2 photograph, rescued off the estate sale table and now framed on Porter's own mantle at home, sat in his mind the whole time he stood there, proof that a stranger's price tag had never once managed to actually put a number on the part of his mother that mattered. She was more than that, Ivy said, echoing the exact thought in Porter's own chest. She was a mom too, and a grandma. She was, Porter agreed. We're going to fix that once the estate's settled properly. I already talked to Bridget about it. A new stone, one that says everything she actually was. Ivy knelt and set one of the surviving birthday cards against the base of the headstone, the 6-year-old one with the cartoon cake, weighing it down with the smooth stone she'd picked up on the walk-in. I wanted her to have this one back, she said, since she never got to see me open it. Porter knelt beside his daughter in the cool grass and let himself finally say the things he'd been carrying since the estate sale, out loud, to the one person who could no longer answer but who he needed to say them to anyway. He told her about the letters he'd written and never heard back from. He told her he was sorry for every year he'd let the silence win instead of driving out to her door and refusing to leave until she opened it. He told her Ivy was going to know her now, through the cards and the journal and every story he could still remember, even if it was 4 years and one funeral too late for anything else. The new headstone went in 6 weeks later, once the estate settlement cleared enough for Porter to order it himself. Granite to match the old one, but the wording entirely his choice this time. Beloved mother, grandmother, and friend. She wrote every year, and she never once stopped. He drove out alone the morning it was installed, before Ivy woke for school, and stood there a long while in the early light, feeling for the first time since the estate sale, like the account between them had finally been settled in full. The house sale never closed. Bridget helped Porter negotiate a private sale months later, on his own terms, to a young family who reminded him, in ways he didn't expect, of who he and Noelle had been in that same kind of house once. He kept the porch swing, its chains rusted and squeaking, and spent a weekend sanding it down and rehanging it himself. The first real carpentry he'd done since the company closed. He kept the mailbox post, too, which struck him as a strange thing to want until he understood, watching Ivy trace her fingers over the dented metal one afternoon, that it was the last object his mother had ever personally handed something through. What Porter wanted most, once the legal machinery finally slowed down, wasn't the money at all, though the money mattered more practically than he'd expected, enough to put a down payment on a small house of his own for the first time in 5 years. What he wanted was an evening at his kitchen table with Ivy and the surviving cards spread out between them, the ones the fire hadn't reached, reading them one at a time in the order his mother had written them. The earliest one, 4 years old, was simple. A child's birthday card with a cartoon cake on the front. Inside, in handwriting Porter hadn't seen in far too long, it read, Dear Ivy, I don't know you as well as I'd like to yet, but I think about you and your dad every single day, and I hope this finds you having the very best birthday a 6-year-old can have. All my love, always, Grandma Vivian. Ivy read it out loud twice, the second time so quietly Porter almost missed it, and then she looked up at him with an expression that broke something open in his chest he'd been holding closed since the funeral he never got to attend. "She really did think about us the whole time," Ivy said, "even when we didn't know it." "She did," Porter said. "Every year, without fail. Somebody just made sure it never reached us. That's not the same as her not trying." They read all of them that night, 4 years worth of birthdays Ivy never got to open in real time. And Porter found himself somewhere around the third card doing something he hadn't managed once since Vivian died, laughing quietly at a joke his mother had written about a cat that no longer belonged to anyone in the family, a small, ordinary thing that made her feel, for one unguarded moment, entirely present in the room with them. Near the bottom of the stack, Ivy found the card from the year Noelle died, and she went still over it in a way that made Porter's chest tighten before he'd even seen what she was looking at. Vivian had written past the standard birthday greeting into a second page, something she hadn't done in any of the others. "I heard about Noelle," she'd written. "I don't know how to reach you right now, and it's breaking my heart that I can't put my arms around my son the way I want to. I hope somebody is taking care of you and that little one. I think about you both every single day, and I always will, no matter how long the quiet lasts." She knew, Ivy said. She knew about Mom, and she still couldn't get to us. "She knew," Porter said. And for the first time all evening, his own voice wasn't steady. "She was grieving right alongside us the whole time, in a house 2 miles away, and neither one of us had any idea the other was going through it alone." When they finished reading, Ivy carried every card upstairs and moved her own keepsake box out from under her bed, the same cedar-scented brand as her grandmother's, though she'd never once known that when she picked it out at a craft store 2 years earlier. She made room at the bottom, beneath her own small collection of things that mattered, and laid the cards in one at a time. Oldest first, the way Vivian had written them. "This is where they belong now," Ivy said, closing the lid with the same careful brass latch her grandmother's box had used. "Somewhere somebody actually gets to keep them." Word of the case had already moved through the warehouse by the time Porter came back for his next shift, and his supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Marion Petrakis, who ran the overnight crew with the same clipped efficiency she brought to everything, pulled him aside near the loading dock instead of just letting it go unmentioned the way he half expected. "I heard about your mother," Marion said, "and I heard about the rest of it too, secondhand, the way these things travel. I want you to know the schedule's flexible for you this month, for the hearings, whatever else comes up. You've never once given me a reason to doubt you were solid, Ashford, and I'm not about to start doubting you now over something that was never your fault to begin with." It was a small thing. 4 sentences from a woman who ran a warehouse and had no obligation to say any of them, and it landed on Porter harder than he expected. A reminder that the version of himself Douglas had spent years quietly diminishing wasn't the only version other people actually saw. Earl Tanner came by a few weeks later with a card of his own, retirement finally sticking now that his knees had officially outvoted his habits, and told Porter over coffee on the new porch that he'd walked that route for 22 years without ever once being thanked for anything more than a wave. "You're the first family that ever made me feel like paying attention actually mattered," Earl said. "I just want you to know that meant something to me too." Bridget closed the file with a note she'd later admit she didn't usually write for clients. Tucked into the final settlement paperwork, she handed Porter across her desk. "Justice in a case like this rarely restores what was actually lost," she'd written. "It can only make sure the truth outlives the person who tried to bury it." Porter kept practicing what he wanted to say to Ivy about all of it, trying out different versions on the drive home from the settlement meeting, the mailbox post from his mother's old yard now standing freshly cemented in his own front lawn. What he settled on that evening, sitting with her on the porch swing he'd salvaged and refinished himself, was simpler than anything he'd rehearsed. "I want you to remember something," he told her. "For whenever you're older and someone you love goes quiet on you, or you go quiet on them, silence doesn't always mean somebody stopped caring. Sometimes it just means somebody's struggling to find their way back, and somebody else is standing in the doorway making sure they never quite make it. If that ever happens to you, don't wait as long as I did to go check." Ivy leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the last of the daylight go orange over a street that was fully theirs now. No forged signature or locked closet standing between them and any of it. The porch swing creaking gently under both their weight. "I won't," she said. "I promise." Porter understood, sitting there with his daughter in the fading evening light, the porch swing rocking slow and even beneath them, that his mother's love had never once stopped moving toward them. It had simply been standing at a locked door for 4 years, waiting patiently, faithfully, for someone to finally check what was on the other side. Douglas had once decided all by himself what Porter was allowed to touch and what he wasn't. In the end, all Porter had ever really wanted back was the one thing his mother refused quietly every single year to stop reaching for.